The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in April of 1878, carried by a dust-covered rider who refused payment and refused to say who sent it. And by the time Rosa Fletcher finished reading its contents, her hands were shaking so badly she had to set it down on the kitchen table of the small house she shared with her aging mother in Abilene, Kansas. The letter was from a lawyer in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, a man named Elijah Cross who claimed to have known her grandfather, Tomas Fletcher, before his death some 15 years prior. The letter explained that Tomas Fletcher had once held a legal homestead claim to nearly 40,000 acres of grazing land along the Sweetwater River, land that had been surveyed and registered in his name in 1858, only for the claim to be violently disputed and ultimately seized by a man named Cornelius Whitaker, a cattleman who had used hired guns and forged documents to drive the Fletcher family from their home. Rosa had grown up hearing fragments of this story from her mother, who spoke of it only in whispers and only when she thought her daughter was asleep. She knew her grandfather had died somewhere out west, that her father had been born on land he never got to inherit, and that the family had scattered eastward with nothing but grief and a few old photographs. What she had never known, until this letter reached her trembling fingers, was that the empire built upon that stolen land still stood, that it had grown into one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, and that it now belonged to Cornelius Whitaker's son, a man named Silas Whitaker. Rosa was 26 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a stubborn independence that had frustrated every suitor who ever called upon her in Abilene. She worked as a seamstress and helped her mother, whose health had been failing for 2 years, and she had never once considered herself the sort of woman who would board a train alone and travel 400 miles into Wyoming Territory to confront a stranger about land she had never seen. But something in Elijah Cross's letter, some phrase about her grandfather's dying wish to see his name cleared, settled into her chest like a hot coal that would not cool. She told her mother she was going to visit a cousin in Denver. It was the only lie she had ever told the woman, and she told it with a steady voice because she knew the truth would only cause her mother pain, memories of a husband long buried and a father-in-law murdered for his ambition to build something honest in a hard country. The train ride took 3 days. Rosa spent them staring out the window at the planes rolling past, thinking of her grandfather's name, Tomas Fletcher, a name she had only ever seen written on a single faded photograph, where a tall man in a black coat stood before a small cabin with his hand resting on a young boy's shoulder. That boy had been her father. The cabin, she now understood, had likely stood somewhere on the very land the Whitaker Cattle Company now claimed as its own. She arrived in the town of Sweetwater crossing on a warm afternoon, the kind of Wyoming spring day where the wind still carried a bite despite the sun's insistence otherwise. The town itself was small but prosperous, built almost entirely on the wealth of a single ranch, the Whitaker spread, which locals spoke of with a mixture of respect and fear. She checked into the only boarding house in town, run by a widow named Mrs. Prout, who eyed Rosa's Kansas dress and city manners with open curiosity. "You are not from around here, Mrs. Prout said, setting a cup of coffee before Rosa in the small dining room. "No, ma'am, I have come on business." "Business with whom, if you do not mind my asking? We do not get many young women traveling alone through Sweetover Crossing, and fewer still with business here." Rosa hesitated only a moment before deciding there was little use in secrecy in a town this size. "I am looking into some old land claims. My grandfather once held property in this area." Mrs. Prout's face changed, the openness in it closing like a door. "You would not be speaking of the Whitaker Range, would you?" "I might be." "Then you had best be careful who you speak to about it, dear. That is a subject folks around here do not discuss lightly." She said nothing further, but the warning hung in the air like smoke. The next morning, Rosa hired a horse and rode out toward the lawyer's office, following the directions in Elijah Cross's letter. She found him in a small building at the edge of town, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who greeted her with the relief of a man who had been waiting a long time to unburden himself. "Miss Fletcher, I confess I did not expect you to come in person. I thought perhaps you would simply write back." "I could not simply write back, Mr. Cross, not after reading what you wrote to me." He gestured her into a chair and pulled out a thick file of papers, yellowed with age. "I was a young clerk in the land office in 1858 when your grandfather filed his claim. I remember him well. A serious man, hardworking, kind to his neighbors. He built a home here, raised cattle of his own, modest at first, and the land was good. Cornelius Whitaker arrived 2 years later with more money than sense and less patience than either. He wanted the water rights along the Sweetwater River, and your grandfather's claim sat squarely across the best of them. What happened?" "What happened, Miss Fletcher, was theft, plain and simple, though it was dressed up in enough legal language that most folks never questioned it. Whitaker paid men to alter the county records. He claimed your grandfather's filing had never been properly registered, that the paperwork was fraudulent. When your grandfather protested when he rode to Cheyenne to demand the territorial governor investigate, men came to his home in the night, burned his barn, killed half his herd. Told him the next fire would not stop at the barn." Rosa's throat tightened, "and no one helped him. No one dared." Whitaker had already begun buying up the loyalty of the local sheriff, the newspaper, even some of the circuit judges. Your grandfather fought as long as he could, but a man cannot fight an empire alone, not when that empire owns the very law meant to protect him. He left in 1863, took what family he had left, and never returned. I always believed, Miss Fletcher, that the truth of what happened deserved to be known, and when I heard some years back that Thomas Fletcher had passed, and that he left behind a granddaughter, I resolved that if ever I found the courage I would write to you." "Why now, after all this time?" Elijah Cross removed his spectacles and rubbed his tired eyes. "Because Cornelius Whitaker is dead these past 3 years, Miss Fletcher, and his son Silas now runs the ranch, and because I still hold in this very office the original registration documents your grandfather filed, hidden away before Whitaker's men could destroy them. I have kept them safe all this time, waiting for someone with the right to claim them." He slid a folder across the desk. Rosa opened it with trembling hands and found there, preserved in careful ink, her grandfather's signature, the survey markings, the official territorial seal. Proof, real and undeniable, that the land had once been his. "What do I do with this?" she asked. "That, Miss Fletcher, is entirely up to you. But I would caution you that Silas Whitaker is not his father. I have watched that young man grow up on this range, and though he inherited his father's empire, I have never once seen him behave with his father's cruelty. Whether he knows the truth of how his family came to own this land, I cannot say. That is something you may have to discover for yourself." Rosa left the lawyer's office with the folder clutched to her chest, and her mind spinning with questions she was not yet prepared to answer. She rode back toward town slowly, the weight of her grandfather's history settling over her like a shawl she had not known she was meant to wear. And it was on that ride, just past a bend where the road dipped toward the river, that she first laid eyes on Silas Whitaker, though she did not yet know his name. He was working a fence line alone, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his dark hair damp with sweat beneath his hat, and when her horse startled at a rabbit darting through the brush, she nearly lost her seat entirely. He was there in an instant, moving with the easy competence of a man who had spent his whole life around horses, catching her mare's bridle and steadying the animal before Rosa even fully understood what had happened. "Easy now," he said, though whether to the horse or to Rosa herself, she could not tell. "You are all right, miss. She just spooked is all." Rosa caught her breath and looked down into a pair of gray eyes set in a face weathered by sun and work, a face that might have been considered stern if not for the gentleness with which he had just handled her mare. "Thank you," she managed. "I did not expect the rabbit any more than she did." Rabbits rarely announce themselves in advance, he said, and there was the faintest hint of humor in his voice. You are new to Sweetwater Crossing. I would remember a face like yours. Rosa felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Wyoming sun. I arrived only yesterday. Staying at Mrs. Pruitt's, I would guess. It is the only respectable place for a lady to stay in town. He released the bridle but did not step back. I am Silas Whitaker. The name landed in Rosa's chest like a stone dropped into still water, and she felt the ripples of it move through her entire body. This was the man. This was the empire her grandfather had lost his home to, standing before her with kind eyes and calloused hands, introducing himself as though he were nothing more than an ordinary rancher. Rosa Fletcher, she said, and watched his face for any flicker of recognition, any sign that the name meant something to him. There was none. He simply nodded as though it were any other name in the world. Well, Miss Fletcher, if you are new to these parts, you ought to be careful riding out alone. This is good country, but it is not always gentle country. There are men out here who would not think twice about causing trouble for a woman traveling by herself. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Whitaker, but I have managed well enough on my own for some time now. Something in her tone must have amused him, because the corner of his mouth lifted in something close to a smile. I do not doubt it. Still, the offer of concern was given freely, and you are welcome to ignore it just as freely. She should have ridden on then. She should have thanked him and continued back toward town, back toward the folder of documents that proved this man's family had stolen everything her grandfather had built. Instead, she found herself lingering, studying his face, searching for some trace of Cornelius Whitaker's cruelty, and finding only warmth and an easy, unhurried patience that unsettled her more than anger would have. Might I ask what brings a woman all the way from, judging by that accent, somewhere east out to a place like Sweetwater Crossing? Silas asked. Rosa's mind raced. She was not yet ready to reveal her purpose, not to this man, not until she understood more of what she was dealing with. Family history, she said carefully. My grandfather once lived in this territory. I am trying to learn more about him. There are not many families who have been out here longer than mine, Silas said. If your grandfather had dealings with the Whitaker Ranch, perhaps I could help you learn something of him. The offer, so innocently given, nearly undid her composure entirely. She managed only a small nod. Perhaps you could, Mr. Whitaker. Perhaps you could indeed. He tipped his hat to her then, and there was something in the gesture, some old-fashioned courtesy that felt genuine rather than performed, that made her chest ache with a confusion she did not want to examine too closely. I hope our paths cross again, Miss Fletcher. I imagine they will, she said, and rode on toward town with her heart pounding for reasons she could not entirely untangle from the anger and grief still churning inside her. Over the following days, Rosa found herself drawn into the rhythms of Sweetwater Crossing in ways she had not anticipated. She spoke with the town's older residents, careful to frame her questions as simple curiosity about local history, and slowly a fuller picture emerged of the Whitaker Empire and its origins. Most people spoke of Cornelius Whitaker, with a caution that suggested old fear had never entirely faded, even years after his death. Silas, by contrast, was spoken of with something closer to respect, even affection, though always with an undercurrent of surprise, as though the town had expected him to become his father and were still adjusting to the fact that he had not. That boy grew up different, an old rancher named Amos told her over coffee at Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house. Cornelius wanted to make him hard, wanted to make him ruthless, send him east to school hoping he would come back sharper, meaner. Instead, the boy came back with his head full of notions about fairness and law and treating folks decent. Caused no end of friction between them, from what I heard. Cornelius near disowned him more than once. And yet Silas inherited the ranch, Rosa said. Cornelius did not have much choice in the end. No other children, and Silas was the only blood he had to leave it to. I think the old man hoped that once Silas had the responsibility of it all, once he understood what it took to hold on to land like that, he would harden up proper, Been 3 years now since Cornelius passed, and if anything the boy has gone the other direction. Pays his hands fair wages. Settled a water dispute with the Bar J outfit without a single shot fired, when his father would have burned them out without blinking. Folks around here have started to trust him, which is more than they ever did his father. This information complicated Rosa's fury in ways she resented. She had come to Sweetwater Crossing, prepared to hate whoever sat at the head of the Whitaker empire, prepared to see in him every cruelty the letter and the lawyer had described. Instead, she found herself hearing of a man who seemed genuinely to be trying to do right by the land and the people around him, a man who had no apparent knowledge that the very foundation of his inheritance was built on violence and theft. She encountered him again 3 days later, this time in town itself, at the general store where she had gone to purchase writing paper to record her thoughts and findings. He was at the counter discussing feed prices with the shopkeeper when he noticed her, and his face brightened in a way that made her stomach twist with unwelcome pleasure. "Miss Fletcher, I had begun to think you had left Sweetwater Crossing already." "Not yet, Mr. Whitaker. There is still much I have not learned. Perhaps I could be of assistance in that learning. I did offer, after all." He glanced at the shopkeeper, then back to her. "Would you care to take supper with me this evening? I find myself curious about your grandfather's history in this territory, and I confess I am rarely given the chance to speak with someone from outside these parts who does not simply want to discuss cattle prices." Every instinct told Rosa to refuse, to protect the careful distance she had been trying to maintain, but a larger part of her, the part that hungered to understand this man before she confronted him with the truth, made her nod instead. "I would like that, Mr. Whitaker." "Silas," he said, "if we are to share a meal, I would prefer you use my given name." "Silas, then," she said, and found the name sat strangely comfortable on her tongue, as though she had been saying it for years rather than days. They dined that evening at a small restaurant attached to the town's only hotel, a modest establishment with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Silas proved himself an attentive companion, asking careful questions about her life in Abilene, about her work as a seamstress, about her mother's health, listening with a genuine interest that made Rosa forget, for stretches of minutes at a time, why she had truly come to this town. "Your grandfather," Silas said eventually, as their plates were cleared away. "You mentioned he had dealings in this territory. What was his name?" Rosa's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, she knew, the moment she could either retreat into vague half-truths or step toward the confrontation she had traveled 400 miles to have. She chose, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, to retreat just once more. "Tomas," she said. "Tomas Fletcher. He held land somewhere in this region many years ago before I was born." She watched his face carefully as she spoke the name, searching again for recognition, and again found none, only polite curiosity. "I do not recognize the name myself, but my father kept extensive records of the ranch's early dealings. If you would like, I could have someone search through them for any mention of a Fletcher." The offer struck her with unexpected force. He was offering, unknowingly, to help her find the very evidence that would condemn his own family's history. She felt suddenly sick with the deception she was engaged in, and yet she could not bring herself to end it, not yet, not until she understood more fully who this man truly was. "I would appreciate that," she said quietly. Over the following 2 weeks, a courtship began that neither of them named as such, but that both, in their private thoughts, recognized for what it was. Silas found reasons to ride into town more often than his work strictly required. Rosa found herself lingering longer at Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house than her original plans had intended, telling herself each day that she would confront him tomorrow, that she would show him the documents tomorrow, that tomorrow she would finally demand justice for her grandfather's stolen home. But tomorrow kept arriving with Silas Whitaker's easy smile, with his surprising gentleness toward the ranch hands who worked for him, with the way he spoke of his mother, long dead, with such tenderness that Rosa's own grief for her father, gone now 3 years, rose up to meet his in a shared understanding neither had expected to find in a stranger. They rode together often, exploring the range that Rosa now understood with growing certainty had once been her grandfather's home. Silas showed her the Sweetwater River where it curved through a wide green valley, the cottonwood trees that grew thick along its banks, the low hills where his father had first built the ranch house that still stood, expanded now into a grand structure that dominated the landscape for miles. "There is an old foundation stone out past the north pasture," Silas told her one afternoon as they walked their horses along a ridge overlooking the valley. "My father always said there had been a cabin there once before he built the main house, some old homesteader's place, abandoned when we arrived. He never spoke much of it, and I never thought to ask more." Rosa's breath caught. "Would you show me?" He led her to it without hesitation, a modest square of stones half buried in prairie grass, the remains of a chimney still visible against the earth. Rosa dismounted and walked slowly around the perimeter of what had once been a home, running her fingers along the weathered stones, and she knew with sudden, overwhelming certainty that she was standing where her grandfather had once raised her father, where a family had built something honest before it was taken from them by fire and violence and lies. "Miss Fletcher, are you unwell?" Silas asked, noting the tears that had begun to slip down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. "This was my grandfather's home," she said, the words finally breaking free after weeks of careful restraint. "This was Tomas Fletcher's land, Silas. Your father did not find it abandoned. He stole it. He burned my grandfather's barn, killed his cattle, threatened his life until he had no choice but to flee with nothing. I have documents, real documents, filed with the territorial government, proving my grandfather's claim to this land predates your father's by 2 full years." Silas stood very still, his face pale beneath his sun-browned skin. "Rosa, that cannot be true. My father built this ranch from nothing. He always said the land was unclaimed when he arrived." "Your father lied, Silas. He lied to you, he lied to the courts, he lied to everyone who ever asked him how he came to own 40,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory. I have the proof. I have had it since before we ever shared our first supper together." Her voice cracked on the confession. "I came here intending to confront you the very first day I arrived. Instead, I let myself fall into something I had no right to feel, not while carrying this secret between us." Silas's jaw tightened, and for a moment Rosa feared she had finally seen the cruelty everyone had warned might still lie beneath his gentle exterior. But when he spoke, his voice was not angry, only quiet and strained with a grief of its own. "Show me," he said. "Show me these documents. I need to see them with my own eyes." They rode back to town in near silence, and Rosa retrieved the folder from her room at Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house, her hands shaking as she handed it to him in the small parlor where Mrs. Pruitt, sensing the gravity of the moment, discreetly withdrew and left them alone. Silas read through the document slowly, his expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to horror as he recognized his father's forged signatures on the county records, as he read Elijah Cross's sworn account of the violence used to drive Tomas Fletcher from his home. When he finally set the papers down, his hands were trembling as badly as Rosa's had been weeks earlier when she first read the lawyer's letter. "I did not know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rosa, I swear to you before God, I did not know. My father told me this land was unclaimed. He told me he built this ranch through honest labor and hard work, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too terrible to consider." "I believe you," Rosa said, and found that she meant it entirely. "I have watched you these past weeks, Silas. I have seen how you treat your hands, how you speak of fairness, how different you are from every story I have heard of your father. I did not want to believe that a man capable of such gentleness could also be the son of a thief, holding stolen land without knowledge of its origins. But I could not simply forget what happened to my grandfather either. I could not fall in love with you while your family's wealth stood upon his grave. The word love hung in the air between them, spoken before either had fully intended it, and Silas looked up at her with an expression that mixed grief and hope in equal measure. You love me. I did not want to, Rosa admitted. I fought against it every single day since that first afternoon on the ridge, when you caught my horse's bridle and looked at me as though I mattered. But yes, Silas Whitaker, I have fallen in love with you, even as I have carried the knowledge of what your family did to mine. Silas rose and crossed the small room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the storm of emotion in his gray eyes. Then let me make this right. Not to win your love, though God knows I want it more than anything, but because it is right, and because the truth of what my father did deserves to be answered honestly. I will return this land, Rosa, every acre of it, if that is what justice requires. Rosa shook her head slowly. I do not want to destroy what you have built here, Silas. I have seen how much good you do for this town, for the families who depend on this ranch for their living. I did not come here to burn down an empire. I came to see my grandfather's name cleared, to have the truth acknowledged. That matters more to me than the land itself. Then we will find a way to do both, Silas said. The truth will be told publicly, and your grandfather's name will be cleared before every person in this territory who ever doubted him. And the land, Rosa, the land itself, I want it to belong to you truly and legally, not as some grand gesture, but because it is your birthright and I will not hold what was stolen, not now that I know the truth. Silas, that is nearly 40,000 acres. You cannot simply hand over an entire cattle operation. I can and I will, though perhaps not in the manner you imagine. He took her hands in his calloused fingers warm against her own. Rosa Fletcher, I am not asking you to take this land from me as punishment. I am asking you to share it with me, as my wife, so that what was stolen from your grandfather might be restored not through loss but through union. Let the Fletcher name and the Whitaker name stand together on this land, as equals, as they should have stood from the very beginning had my father possessed an ounce of honor. Rosa felt tears rising again, though these carried none of the grief of moments before. You are asking me to marry you, Silas Whitaker, in the very same conversation where you learned your father was a thief and a murderer. I am asking you to marry me because in the weeks I have known you, you have shown me more honesty and courage than I have encountered in my entire life, and because I love you, Rosa, more than I have loved anything in this world, including this land that suddenly feels tainted by knowledge I cannot unlearn. I do not know how to separate my feelings for you from the guilt I now carry for my father's sins, and I do not wish to separate them. I want to build something new here, something honest, and I cannot imagine building it with anyone but you. Rosa studied his face for a long moment, searching for any hesitation, any falseness, and found only raw sincerity staring back at her. This is a great deal to consider, Silas. My grandfather suffered greatly because of your family. My father grew up in poverty because of what happened here. I cannot simply set aside a lifetime of inherited grief because you have offered me marriage and a share of stolen land. I do not ask you to set it aside, Silas said gently. I ask you to let me help you carry it, and to let me spend the rest of my life making amends for what cannot be undone, and building something better in its place. Take whatever time you need to decide, Rosa. I will not press you further tonight, but know that my offer comes from love, not obligation, and it will remain open for as long as you need. He left her alone in the parlor that evening, and Rosa sat for a long while staring at the document spread across the table, thinking of her grandfather's face in the faded photograph, thinking of her father's quiet sorrow whenever the subject of Wyoming arose, thinking of Silas Whitaker's gray eyes and the honest grief she had seen in them upon learning the truth of his inheritance. She wrote to her mother that night, finally telling the truth of why she had traveled west, describing everything she had learned and everything that had transpired between herself and Silas. She did not ask for permission or advice, only shared the truth, trusting her mother to understand the weight of what she now faced. The following morning, news of the discovery spread through Sweetwater Crossing with the speed such things always traveled in small towns. Silas had not waited for Rosa's answer to begin setting matters right. He rode into town at dawn and called upon Elijah Cross directly, spending hours in the lawyer's office reviewing every document, every account of his father's crimes, and by midday, he had summoned the town's newspaper editor and the county sheriff to lay out the full truth publicly. Word reached Rosa at the boarding house before Silas himself did, carried by an excited Mrs. Prout who could barely contain her astonishment. "He is telling everyone, dear, right there in the street outside the newspaper office, telling them his father stole the Fletcher land, telling them he intends to make it right. I never in all my years expected to see a Whitaker admit to such a thing." Rosa hurried into the street to find a small crowd gathered, drawn by curiosity and the rare spectacle of Silas Whitaker standing atop a wagon bed, addressing the townsfolk with a clear, steady voice, despite the visible strain on his face. "My father built this ranch through theft and violence," Silas was saying as Rosa arrived at the edge of the crowd. "He drove Tomas Fletcher from land that was legally his, using forged documents and hired guns to accomplish what honest dealing could not. I did not know this truth until yesterday, but knowing it now, I cannot in good conscience continue to benefit from my father's crimes without answering for them. The Fletcher family will be made whole. This is not charity. It is justice, long delayed." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some skeptical, some approving, and Rosa felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her as Silas's gaze found hers across the gathered townsfolk. He climbed down from the wagon and walked directly to her, ignoring the whispers that followed. "I did not wish to wait for your answer before doing what was right," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Whatever you decide about us, Rosa, the truth needed to be told, and your grandfather's name needed to be cleared before this entire territory. That much, at least, I could accomplish without your permission." Rosa felt something inside her chest loosen, some final knot of doubt unraveling in the face of his public honesty. "You have made yourself vulnerable before this whole town, Silas. Your standing, your reputation, everything your father built through fear now stands exposed as fraud." "Everything my father built through fear was never worth having," Silas replied. "If this town thinks less of me for admitting the truth, then I would rather have their honest scorn than their fearful respect built on lies." It was there, in the dusty street of Sweetwater Crossing with half the town watching, that Rosa finally allowed herself to fully embrace what had been growing in her heart for weeks. "Ask me again, Silas Whitaker. Ask me what you asked me last night, and this time I will give you my answer before witnesses, so that no one in this territory can claim we built our future on anything but truth." Silas's face broke into a smile so genuine it seemed to erase years of the careful restraint he had learned from a hard father. He took her hands in the middle of the street, in front of the newspaper editor and the sheriff and Mrs. Prout, and the dozens of curious townsfolk who had gathered to witness the unraveling of the Whitaker family's darkest secret. "Rosa Fletcher, will you marry me? Not to erase the past, for that cannot be erased, but to build something honest upon it together as equals, as partners in every sense the law and my heart can offer." "Yes," Rosa said, her voice clear and unwavering despite the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Silas Whitaker, I will marry you." The crowd's murmurs shifted to something warmer, and even those who had entered the street skeptical of a Whitaker's sudden confession found themselves swept into the romance of the moment, into the sight of two young people choosing love and honesty over inherited grievance and generational shame. But justice, however heartfelt the proposal, required more than words spoken in a dusty street, and over the following weeks Rosa and Silas worked together with Elijah Cross to formalize what needed to be done. The lawyer drew up new deeds, transferring legal ownership of the core 40,000 acres, the original Fletcher claim, into Rosa's name outright, with the surrounding acreage that Silas had legitimately expanded through his own honest dealings remaining part of what would become, upon their marriage, a shared family enterprise. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne required formal review of the original 1858 documents, and Silas himself traveled there with Rosa to present the evidence personally, testifying against his own father's memory with a steadiness that impressed even the skeptical territorial officials who reviewed the case. The process took the better part of 2 months, filled with legal proceedings, depositions from old-timers like Amos who remembered the original violence, and careful examination of the forged county records that Elijah Cross had preserved for exactly this purpose. During those months, Rosa and Silas's courtship deepened into something neither had anticipated when they first met on that ridge above the Sweetwater River. They spent long evenings together, sometimes discussing the legal proceedings, more often simply learning the small details of each other's lives that courtship allows two people to discover. Rosa learned that Silas had lost his mother to fever when he was 12, that his father's subsequent hardening had driven a wedge between them that never fully closed before Cornelius Whitaker's death, that Silas had spent years secretly wishing for a different kind of life even as he dutifully learned to run the ranch his father demanded he inherit. Silas learned that Rosa's father had died of consumption 3 years earlier, that her mother's health had been declining ever since, that Rosa had supported herself through seamstress work while caring for her mother, and had never expected marriage to be part of her future, having watched too many suitors retreat when they realized she would not abandon her familial responsibilities for the sake of romance. "You will not have to choose between us," Silas told her one evening as they sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the valley that would soon, in a legal sense, belong entirely to Rosa. "Your mother will always have a home here, Rosa, for as long as she lives. I would not dream of asking you to abandon her. She may not wish to leave Kansas," Rosa said. "Her whole life is there, her friends, her church. Then we will build her a home wherever she wishes it, close enough that you may visit as often as you need, or far enough that she remains comfortable in familiar surroundings. There are many ways to honor family, Rosa. I intend to make certain your mother knows she has not lost a daughter to marriage, only gained a son who wishes to see her cared for properly." Such conversations, repeated in various forms over the following weeks, slowly convinced Rosa that Silas Whitaker was exactly the man his actions suggested, a man determined to build a marriage on partnership and mutual respect, rather than the dominance and control that had characterized his father's approach to every relationship in his life, whether with land, with cattle, or with the people unfortunate enough to stand in his way. Not everyone in Sweetwater Crossing welcomed the changes so readily, however. A faction of the ranch hands, men who had worked under Cornelius Whitaker's harsh regime and expected similar treatment to continue under his son, grew uneasy at rumors that the ranch's ownership structure was shifting, that a stranger from Kansas now held legal claim to the very land they had built their livelihoods upon. Chief among the discontented was a foreman named Reuben Hayes, a man who had served as Cornelius Whitaker's most loyal enforcer during the years of violent expansion, and who viewed Rosa's arrival with open hostility. "You think this changes anything?" Reuben confronted Rosa directly one afternoon while she was walking the north pasture alone, examining the old foundation stones of her grandfather's original cabin. "Whitaker land has always been Whitaker land, girl, no matter what paper some lawyer conjures up. Cornelius built this ranch with blood and sweat, and no amount of guilty conscience from his soft son is going to hand it over to some Kansas seamstress with a sad story." Rosa held her ground despite the menace in his voice. "The law disagrees with you, Mr. Hayes. The Territorial Land Office has already begun reviewing the original documents, and Silas himself has confirmed their authenticity. This land was stolen from my grandfather, and it is being returned through proper legal process, not sentiment. Proper legal process, Reuben spat, moving closer with an aggression that made Rosa's heart pound with sudden fear. There was nothing proper about how Cornelius built this empire, and there is nothing proper about handing it over to a stranger just because Silas has grown a conscience he never needed before you showed up batting your eyes at him. Some of us built our lives around this ranch, remaining Whitaker land. We are not about to let that change without a fight. Before the confrontation could escalate further, the sound of an approaching horse interrupted them, and Silas himself rode into view, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him. He dismounted quickly and positioned himself between Rosa and the foreman, his voice carrying an authority Rosa had not heard from him before. "Reuben, whatever business you have, you will conduct it with me, not with Miss Fletcher. If I find you have approached her again in this manner, you will find yourself without employment on this ranch, regardless of how many years you served my father." Reuben's jaw tightened with barely suppressed anger. "Your father would never have tolerated this, Silas. Giving away half his empire because some woman shows up with old papers and a sad story about her grandfather. Cornelius built this ranch through strength, and you are dismantling it through weakness." "My father built this ranch through theft and murder," Silas replied, his voice hard as flint. "I have spent the past 2 months confirming that truth beyond any doubt. If loyalty to his memory requires me to continue benefiting from his crimes, then I reject that loyalty entirely. You have served this ranch faithfully in many ways, Reuben, but if you cannot accept the direction this ranch is taking, I will understand your decision to seek employment elsewhere. What I will not accept is any further threat, implied or otherwise, toward the woman I intend to marry." The tension between the two men stretched taut for several long moments before Reuben finally backed down, muttering something under his breath about soft city ways ruining honest ranch work, and stalked off toward the bunkhouse. Silas turned immediately to Rosa, concern etched across his features. "Are you unharmed? I should never have allowed you to walk this land alone, not with feelings running as high as they have been these past weeks." "I am unharmed, Silas, though I confess he frightened me more than I wish to admit." Rosa found herself trembling slightly now that the confrontation had passed, the adrenaline of the moment fading into shakiness. "Is he dangerous? Should we be concerned about further trouble from him? He was among my father's most trusted men during the years of the original land dispute," Silas said grimly. "I do not know for certain, but I suspect he may have been one of those who rode against your grandfather all those years ago. I will speak with Elijah Cross about whether his testimony might be needed for the formal legal proceedings, and I will ensure he is watched carefully in the meantime. You must promise me you will not walk these pastures alone again until matters are fully settled." Rosa nodded, shaken but grateful for Silas's protective concern, and allowed him to escort her back toward the main house, his arm steady around her shoulders as they walked. That evening, Silas dismissed Reuben Hayes from his employment entirely, providing him with his final wages but making clear that his services would no longer be required on the Whitaker ranch. Reuben left Sweetwater Crossing within the week, and though rumors persisted for some time about his bitter departure, no further threats materialized, and the incident served mainly to strengthen the town's growing perception that Silas Whitaker was indeed determined to build something different from his father's legacy. As spring gave way to summer, the formal legal proceedings finally concluded. The Territorial Land Office issued its official ruling, confirming Thomas Fletcher's original 1858 claim as legitimate and voiding the fraudulent documents Cornelius Whitaker had used to seize the property. Rosa Fletcher was formally recognized as the rightful heir to the original 40,000 acres, and in a ceremony held at the county courthouse in Cheyenne, witnessed by Elijah Cross and several territorial officials, the deed was formally transferred into her name. Elijah Cross, standing beside her as the papers were finalized, could not hide the emotion in his voice. "Your grandfather would be proud beyond words, Miss Fletcher. I have waited 15 years to see this day, never truly believing it would come. Tomas Fletcher's name is cleared, his claim restored, and justice, however delayed, has finally been served." Rosa embraced the old lawyer with tears in her eyes. "I could not have done this without you, Mr. Cross. Your courage in preserving these documents all these years, in finally sending that letter, has changed everything for my family." "It was the least I could do for a man I respected greatly," Elijah replied. "I only wish Tomas had lived to see this day himself, but perhaps, in seeing his granddaughter restored to his rightful legacy and finding love in the process, some measure of justice has finally been achieved that even he could not have imagined." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a warm June morning beneath the wide Wyoming sky, at the very site of the old cabin foundation where Rosa's grandfather had once raised her father. Silas had insisted on the location, believing it fitting that their union should be blessed at the exact place where the original injustice had occurred, transforming a site of theft and violence into one of love and restoration. Rosa's mother had made the journey from Kansas despite her failing health, insisting she would not miss her only daughter's wedding regardless of the distance or the strain it placed upon her. She arrived a week before the ceremony, and Rosa watched with quiet joy as her mother walked the grounds of what had once been her husband's family's stolen inheritance, now legally restored to their bloodline through her daughter's courage and love. "Your grandfather always believed justice would come eventually," Rosa's mother told her the evening before the wedding, as they sat together in the guest room prepared for her at the main ranch house. "He used to say that truth has patience, even when men do not. I only wish he had lived to see how right he was. I wish that too, Mother, but I believe he would be glad to know that I found more than justice here. I found love as well, with a man who proved himself honorable despite the sins of his father." "Silas Whitaker is a good man," her mother agreed. "I have watched him these past days, watched how he treats you, how he speaks of building something new here rather than simply inheriting what came before. Your father would have approved of him, Rosa. I am certain of that." The wedding ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving, attended by nearly the entire population of Sweetwater Crossing, who had come to view the union of Rosa Fletcher and Silas Whitaker as something of a symbolic healing for the whole territory, a resolution of old wounds that many had assumed would never truly close. Reverend Mills, who had served the small community for over a decade, spoke movingly of restoration and second chances, of how love could transform even the darkest histories into foundations for something beautiful. Rosa wore a simple ivory dress she had sewn herself in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, using skills learned through years of seamstress work in Abilene. And as she walked toward Silas across the grass that grew now where her grandfather's cabin had once stood, she felt the weight of generations settling into something finally at peace. Silas stood waiting for her in a dark suit, his gray eyes bright with unshed tears as she approached, and when they exchanged their vows, promising partnership and honesty and enduring love, the assembled crowd could not help but feel they were witnessing something larger than a simple wedding, a genuine reconciliation of past injustice with present hope. "I promise to build with you, not upon you," Silas said during his vows, departing from traditional language to speak words he had clearly composed himself. "I promise that whatever we create together on this land will honor both our families, the one that built it through hard work and the one that was wronged in the process of its building. I promise to spend every day of our marriage ensuring that the empire my father created through theft becomes, through our partnership, something worthy of the name legacy rather than the name crime." Rosa, in turn, spoke her own promise with a steady voice that carried across the assembled crowd. "I promise to forgive what can be forgiven, and to remember what should be remembered, so that we might build a future that neither denies the pain of the past nor allows it to poison what comes after. I promise to love you not despite your father's sins, but because you have shown yourself capable of choosing a different path than the one he set for you. Their first kiss as husband and wife drew genuine cheers from the assembled crowd, and even Mrs. Prout, watching from among the guests, dabbed at tears with her handkerchief while declaring to anyone nearby that she had never witnessed such a fitting resolution to old troubles in all her years in Sweetwater Crossing. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music provided by local musicians and food prepared by nearly every woman in town, each contributing dishes in a spirit of communal celebration that reflected the town's genuine investment in seeing this particular love story reach its happy conclusion. Rosa danced with Silas beneath the stars that emerged as darkness settled over the valley, and later danced with Elijah Cross, who confessed through happy tears that he had never expected his letter to result in such joy, having anticipated only legal proceedings and perhaps some measure of justice, never imagining it might also produce a marriage born of genuine love. "You have given me back my family's honor," Rosa told him as they danced slowly beneath the lantern light strung between the porch posts of the ranch house. "But more than that, you have given me a chance at happiness I never expected to find when I first read your letter." "I merely told the truth, Mrs. Whitaker," Elijah replied, using her new name with evident pride. "The rest, the love, the healing, that was accomplished by your own courage and Silas's honor. I only provided the spark. You too provided the flame." As the seasons turned, and the initial excitement of the wedding settled into the steady rhythm of married life, Rosa and Silas began the work of truly building something new upon land that had witnessed both theft and restoration. They renamed the combined operation the Fletcher-Whitaker Ranch, a deliberate acknowledgement of both family histories, and Silas insisted that the original Fletcher name appear first on every sign and document, a small but meaningful gesture toward the justice that had finally been achieved. They worked together closely in managing the ranch, with Rosa proving herself a quick study in matters of cattle ranching despite her background as a seamstress, and Silas learning, in turn, to value the kind of careful attention to detail and fairness that Rosa brought to every decision, whether involving the treatment of ranch hands or negotiations with neighboring outfits over water rights and grazing boundaries. Where Cornelius Whitaker had ruled through fear and violence, Rosa and Silas built their operation through fair wages, honest dealing, and a reputation for integrity that slowly transformed how the entire territory viewed the Whitaker name. Rosa's mother, after much consideration, chose to relocate permanently to Wyoming Territory, settling into a comfortable cottage built specifically for her on the ranch grounds, close enough to visit her daughter daily but private enough to maintain her independence. Her health improved noticeably in the clean mountain air, and she lived to see, within the first year of Rosa and Silas's marriage, the birth of her first grandchild. Rosa gave birth to a son in the spring of 1879, nearly 1 year after that fateful letter had first arrived in Abilene. They named him Thomas, after Rosa's grandfather, though they used the more common spelling rather than the Spanish variant his great-grandfather had carried, a small acknowledgement of the family's blended heritage moving forward into a new generation. Silas held his newborn son on the very ridge overlooking the Sweetwater River where he had first caught Rosa's spooked horse, and told the infant, with tears openly falling down his weathered cheeks, that he would grow up knowing the true history of his family, both its shame and its redemption. "You will know both truths, little Thomas," Silas whispered to his son. "You will know that your great-great-grandfather was wronged, and you will know that wrong was eventually righted through courage and love. That is a better inheritance than empty land ever could have been." 2 years later, Rosa gave birth to a second child, a daughter they named Elena, after Rosa's own mother, and the family that had once seemed destined for permanent estrangement between Fletchers and Whitakers instead flourished into something neither Cornelius Whitaker's violence nor circumstance could have anticipated, a genuine blending of two bloodlines into a shared future built on honesty rather than deception. Elijah Cross remained a close family friend throughout these years, visiting the ranch regularly and taking evident joy in watching the children grow, often telling young Thomas and Alina the full story of how their parents had met, embellishing certain details with each retelling, until the tale took on something of the quality of legend among the ranch hands and townsfolk who had witnessed the original events unfold. The old foundation stones where Tomas Fletcher's original cabin had stood remained undisturbed on the ranch grounds, and Rosa insisted they be preserved rather than built over, creating instead a small garden around the site where she planted wildflowers each spring, a living memorial to her grandfather's original dream and the family's eventual restoration of what had been stolen from him. She would often walk there in quiet moments, sometimes with Silas, sometimes alone with her children, telling them stories of the great-great-grandfather they had never known but whose legacy now flourished in the very ground beneath their feet. Sweetwater Crossing itself flourished alongside the reformed ranch, as Silas and Rosa's fair business practices attracted new settlers and encouraged existing residents to invest more confidently in the town's future, no longer fearful of arbitrary cruelty from the region's dominant landholder. The town grew from a small collection of buildings into a proper settlement, complete with a school where Thomas and Alina would eventually receive their early education, and a church that Reverend Mills expanded twice over the following decade to accommodate the growing congregation. Rosa maintained correspondence with friends back in Abilene throughout these years, sharing news of her growing family and the successful resolution of her grandfather's old grievance, and several of her former acquaintances eventually made the journey west themselves to witness firsthand the transformation of what had once seemed an impossible tale of injustice into a genuine happy ending worthy of any storybook romance. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Silas surprised Rosa with a small ceremony at the foundation stones, renewing their vows in the presence of their two children, Rosa's mother and Elijah Cross, all gathered to celebrate not just their marriage, but the ongoing success of the partnership they had built together. Reverend Mills, older now but still serving the community with evident devotion, spoke again of restoration and healing, noting how the Fletcher Whitaker Ranch had become something of a symbol throughout the territory for how old wounds might genuinely be healed rather than simply forgotten or ignored. 5 years ago, Reverend Mills said during the small ceremony, I stood on this very ground and spoke of justice long delayed finally arriving. Today, I stand here again to witness that justice was not merely a single moment of legal correction, but an ongoing commitment these two have honored every single day of their marriage. Rosa and Silas Whitaker have shown this entire territory that love built on honesty, however complicated its origins, can flourish into something truly beautiful. Rosa, listening to these words with her young son standing solemnly beside her, and her infant daughter held gently in Silas's arms, felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the path that had led her to this moment. She thought often, in these quiet, reflective times, of the frightened young woman who had boarded that train in Abilene 4 years earlier, uncertain of what she would find and terrified of the confrontation she believed awaited her. She could never have imagined then that her journey would lead not merely to justice for her grandfather, but to a love story that would heal not just her own family's old wounds, but transform an entire community's relationship with its own difficult history. Silas, for his part, had grown into exactly the kind of man his father had once feared he might become, gentle rather than ruthless, fair rather than dominating, and yet paradoxically more successful and more respected throughout the territory than Cornelius Whitaker had ever managed to be through fear and violence. The Fletcher Whitaker Ranch became known throughout Wyoming Territory, not merely for the quality of its cattle, but for the integrity of its dealings, and neighboring ranchers who had once feared the Whitaker name now sought partnership and friendship instead, recognizing in Silas a business partner whose word could be trusted absolutely. As their children grew, Rosa took particular care to ensure they understood the full history of their family's complicated legacy, believing that honesty about the past, however painful, provided a stronger foundation for the future than convenient silence ever could. Thomas, showing early signs of his father's practical competence with ranch work, combined with something of his mother's careful attention to fairness in dealing with others, seemed destined to eventually inherit management of the ranch himself, while Alina displayed an early interest in the legal proceedings that had originally restored her family's fortune, often begging Elijah Cross during his visits to explain again exactly how documents and law had combined to right an old wrong. "Perhaps she will become a lawyer herself someday," Elijah observed during one such visit, watching young Alina, now 6 years old, carefully examining an old land survey map spread across the study table. Women are not commonly admitted to practice law in most territories yet, but times are changing, and who knows what opportunities might exist by the time she comes of age. "Whatever path she chooses," Rosa said, watching her daughter with evident pride, "I hope she carries forward the same commitment to justice that brought her parents together in the first place." The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of ranch life, punctuated by the ordinary joys and occasional sorrows that mark any family's journey through time. Rosa's mother lived to see both her grandchildren reach their early teenage years before passing peacefully in her sleep one winter evening, having lived long enough to witness her husband's father's memory finally honored through the restoration of the family's rightful legacy. Her death brought genuine grief to the entire ranch community, but also a sense of completion, knowing she had lived to see justice fully realized before her passing. Silas and Rosa buried her near the old foundation stones, beside a small marker they had placed years earlier in memory of Rosa Fletcher himself, whose body remained buried in Kansas, but whose spirit, Rosa always believed, had finally found peace through the restoration of his stolen legacy. The small family cemetery grew over the years to include other markers as well, testament to a family firmly rooting itself in Wyoming soil after generations of displacement and grief. By the time Thomas reached 18 years of age in 1897, ready to take on increasing responsibility for the ranch's daily operations, the Fletcher-Whitaker operation had grown to become one of the most respected cattle enterprises in the entire territory, known throughout the region for fair dealing, quality livestock, and a family history that had become something of local legend. Told and retold in town gatherings, and passed down through generations of Sweetwater Crossing residents, as an example of how love and honesty could triumph over even the deepest injustices. Rosa, now in her middle 40s, often found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. From a fearful young seamstress in Abilene who had never expected marriage or adventure, to the matriarch of a thriving ranch family whose story had become woven into the very fabric of the territory's history. She would sometimes walk alone to the old foundation stones, now surrounded by a garden that had grown wild and beautiful over the decades, and speak quietly to her grandfather's memory, telling him of the family's continued success, of grandchildren now being born who would carry forward both the Fletcher and Whitaker names with equal pride. Silas, aging alongside her with the same steady grace he had shown throughout their marriage, remained as devoted to Rosa in his later years as he had been during their initial courtship, and their love, rather than fading with the passage of time, seemed instead to deepen into something even more profound, tested and proven through decades of shared labor, shared joy, and shared commitment to building something genuinely good from the ashes of old wrongdoing. "Do you ever regret it?" Rosa asked him once, many years after their wedding, as they sat together on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard below. Learning the truth about your father, giving up half of what you inherited, choosing this path rather than simply continuing as your father intended. Silas took her weathered hand in his own, still strong despite the years of hard ranch work etched into his calloused palms. I have never once regretted it, Rosa. Not for a single day. What I inherited from my father was built on lies and violence, hollow despite its size. What we built together, however much smaller it may have seemed at the beginning, has proven infinitely richer than anything Cornelius Whitaker ever imagined possible. I would choose this path again, every single time, without hesitation. Even knowing how difficult those first months were. The confrontation with Reuben Hayes, the uncertainty of the legal proceedings, the risk of losing everything you had known. Especially knowing all of that, Silas replied, because it led me to you, and to this life we have built together, and to these grandchildren playing below us who will grow up knowing only fairness and love rather than the fear and violence that shaped my own childhood. That is worth every difficulty we faced along the way, Rosa. That is worth everything. Their story, over the decades, became something of a local legend throughout Wyoming Territory, told at community gatherings and passed down through generations, as an example of how the deepest historical wrongs might genuinely be addressed through courage, honesty, and love, rather than through continued cycles of resentment and violence. Young couples in Sweetwater Crossing, contemplating their own futures, would sometimes visit the old foundation stones on the Fletcher Whitaker Ranch, drawn by the romance of the story, seeking perhaps some measure of the same courage that had allowed Rosa Fletcher and Silas Whitaker to build something beautiful from circumstances that might easily have produced only bitterness and continued conflict. By the time Rosa reached her 70th year, the ranch had passed largely into the capable hands of her son Thomas and his own growing family, while Alina had indeed pursued studies in law, becoming one of the first women admitted to practice in Wyoming's courts, carrying forward her parents' legacy of fighting for justice in ways her mother could never have imagined possible during her own youth in Kansas. Rosa and Silas, in their later years, spent quiet contentment together on the porch of the same ranch house, where their courtship had first blossomed, watching sunsets paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors over land that had witnessed both terrible injustice and, eventually, profound redemption. Silas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, with Rosa beside him, having lived a full life built on the foundation of honesty and love they had established together decades earlier. Rosa herself lived 3 more years beyond his passing, surrounded always by children and grandchildren, who ensured she never lacked for company or love. And when she finally joined her husband in death, she was buried beside him near the old foundation stones, close to her grandfather's memorial marker, completing a circle of justice and love that had begun with a single letter arriving in Abilene, Kansas, so many decades earlier. The Fletcher Whitaker Ranch continued to prosper long after both Rosa and Silas had passed, carried forward by their children and grandchildren, who never forgot the story of courage and honesty that had established their family's legacy. The old foundation stones remained preserved throughout subsequent generations, a permanent reminder of both the injustice their family had suffered and the redemption that had eventually been achieved through the union of Rosa Fletcher and Silas Whitaker, 2 young people who had chosen love and honesty over inherited bitterness, and who had proven, through the entire course of their lives together, that even the deepest historical wrongs might eventually find genuine healing when approached with courage, truth, and an unwavering commitment to building something better than what came before. Their story remained, for generations afterward, a testament to the power of love to transform even the most painful histories into foundations for lasting happiness. A Wild West romance that had begun with theft and violence but had ended, through the courage of 2 remarkable individuals, in genuine justice, deep and abiding love, and a family legacy that continued to flourish upon the very ground where such profound wrong had once been committed against an honest, hard-working man named Tomas Fletcher, whose granddaughter had finally, after so many years, brought his name the honor and restoration it had always deserved.